I will introduce now Dr. Arran Rees, who is from the Congruence Engine, working at the University of Leeds. Arran is a researcher and a museum practitioner. He uses action, focus, and collaborative research methodologies, and his research interests intersect between museum collections management, digital contemporary collecting practices, and alternative models for ownership and sharing of cultural heritage. Before joining the University of Leeds, Arran worked at the V&A and at the Museum of Cardiff. So, Arran, thank you very much for joining us. Also, thank you for Congruence Engine for sharing the time with us. And whenever you're ready, please feel free to start sharing your presentation. All good, full screen. Thank you.
Great. Can you can see that, have you?
Yes, all good, full
Yeah,
screen,
great.
and perfect audio.
Thank you. So thanks, Javier, and to Sophie and Michelle for the work involved in coordinating today. As Javier said, I'm Arran Rees, and I'm a research fellow on the Congruence Engine. I'm one of the co-Is based at the University of Leeds, facilitating the action research for the project. And I co-facilitate this with Helen Graham, who's also at the University of Leeds. And also, as Javier said, my background's in museum work, both curatorial and collections management. Most of the research I've undertaken in the past uses action research as its method. So my plan for today is to walk through how we've employed action research in the Congruence Engine, with a particular focus on the ideas of emergence, complexity, and how they have figured in our work. I'll touch on what I think has been enabled through the action research, and then finish up with some critical reflections on the process so far, I suppose. So this being a Towards National Collections seminar series, I am sure some of you will already be aware of Congruence Engine, as it is a TaNC funded project. However, for those of you less familiar with it, Congruence Engine is a 3-year project looking at different approaches to linking collections related to industrial heritage. It has 3 major thematic focuses: the textile industry, the energy industry, and the communications industry. We're large. We have 14 project partners, 14 investigators, 11 research fellows and digital practitioners. And altogether, I think there are about 60 people involved to various degrees in the project, all from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and with different perspectives on the world. So over the course of the project, we've developed over 40 investigations or lines of inquiry. And these are all of various scale and depth. Some have developed entire processes, taking objects through digitization to linkage with other materials. Others are smaller proof of concept experiments or investigations that have met blockers that we've had to park and write up. As I've already nodded to, and Javier also explained, we're using action research as our project methodology. At its simplest, action research is a broad orientation towards research that works through roughly defined cycles of planning, acting, observing, reflecting, and then planning forward again based on what you've learned on the previous cycle. So action research works in line with many other types of methods too. It seeks to be contextually appropriate to the ways the experiments are happening and the places the experiments are happening in. It's generally used to address real life problems that can be intervened with in some way or another. In Congruence Engine, we are using a particular type of action research called systemic action research. It uses the same kind of cycle you can see on the screen there in theory, but with an active recognition that this kind of linear approach to cause and effect is difficult or impossible to discern in complex social situations. So systemic action research understands the world to be inherently social, complex, and interconnected. And it really resists this idea of trying to treat issues as isolated pieces of a puzzle to be fixed individually. Alongside that, action research more broadly accepts that there's no real objective truth, but multiple perspectives and ways of knowing the world. So in action research, we can never really understand the whole issue from every perspective, but what we're seeking to do is better understand the whole by working through multiple viewpoints, iteratively and undertaking actions, observing them, reflecting on what happened and learning from those. So there are a variety of principles within action research because it's really broad, but there are a few that we felt that were particularly important to the work that we wanted to do. So first of all is an expanded epistemology. So this is quite foundational to most forms of action research. We need to facilitate and enable a range of ways of knowing in the project. There's knowing through theorizing, through acting, through feeling, through making. There's knowing through forming social relationships and understanding new dynamics through that. And we really wanted to facilitate this happening. Secondly, we really do try to surface the importance of multiple perspectives. So we wanted to create a project structure that aligned with this action research approach to no objective truth, and a way that sees the best way of trying to work out through the problem is from multiple angles. Additionally, we wanted to be able to do the research in a way that people best feel like they align to. People who can bring themselves to work are more energized to do research that matters to them. And it is at the core of our belief that a diversity of experiences only enriches the research process. Third, we wanted to enable a variety of ways to participate in the research. We wanted to encourage people to work across investigations that are happening at different times, working at different scales and working at different speeds. We wanted to make sure that there was an open approach to getting involved, so people could work on research that resonated with them and in a way that aligns with their individual capacities at the time. And then finally, we wanted to create a culture where non-agreement is not seen as a failure. So we are acutely aware that resonance is important when people want to do research that matters to them, but that we can't and we shouldn't always seek to work towards complete consensus. Whilst we might think in a perfect world, everyone would agree on how things should be done, in reality, that wouldn't reflect the messy, social and complex world that we live in. So our embracing of complexity and multiple perspectives means that we need to ensure that divergence is allowed for without it being conflict and being considered as failure. So I've noted that our action research methodology seeks to work with the concepts of complexity and emergence. Both of these have relatively self-evident vernacular understandings, I suppose, but when you forefront them as core considerations in your research and your approach to research, they really do make a difference to the way in which you approach things. So I have my colleague Julia Ankerbrand to thank for this quote, which I think really illustrates what complexity brings when you center it in the way you're thinking about research. So a complexity worldview sees the world as essentially interconnected and rich with forms and patterns that have been shaped by history and context. It reminds us of the limits to certainty. It emphasizes that things are in a continual process of becoming, and that there is potential for startlingly new futures where what emerges can be unexpected and astonishing. So complexity here really refers to the interconnected, sometimes messy relations between us and things that we cannot properly understand if it's flattened out. When you treat things as predictable, wholly categorizable with binary forms of truth and knowledge, then you fail to take into account the parts of the picture that you don't yet understand or even know about. By working with complexity, it requires an openness to emergence as well, I suppose. And for us, working with emergence at our core has enabled a dexterity, I suppose, with unforeseen and unknown happenings in the project. It has enabled us as a project to follow opportunity spaces as they arise, rather than to be too rigidly fixed to our predefined work packages that was decided a year before the project even started. So with this dynamism also comes a degree of uncertainty, I suppose. And this is something that's been present through the research. There is a tentativeness that we have to acknowledge that while some people find energizing, others find quite immobilizing and difficult to navigate through. Overall, I agree with Danny Burns, who is one of the leaders in systemic action research, that emergent understandings fashions new pathways to action in the real time of their creation. So that is a bit of a kind of whistle stop through what emergence and complexity means for us in our work. So if we're embracing multiplicity and working with complexity and leaning into the notion of emergence, what does that actually look like in the project? So we dedicated some time at the beginning of the project to creating working groups based on the original work packages outlined in the project application. As the pace of the project picked up, we shifted and iteratively designed a model of investigations that enabled researchers to develop inquiries based on their own interests and expertise in collaboration with project partners and available datasets. Over the course of the project, we've adapted to use different language and processes to support our investigations. Initially, we had what we called mini investigations generated through project workshops. And then from there, we extended some of those mini investigations and renamed them investigations, acknowledging that they weren't mini at all, that they'd really grown. We created a set of meetings where investigations could be discussed across the project, helping to enable points of connections where apparent, and to enable input from those who have a range of different skills, interests, and knowledge. And as time went on, our investigations naturally began to develop into clusters, and we tried to actively form clusters from those. However, sometimes they felt a bit arbitrary and forced, so we ended up being quite short-lived and moved toward a broader kind of 5-point categorization of the investigations that we're now using. And they increasingly are being worked on by multiple research fellows and feature multiple investigations all working together. And I'll reflect a little bit more on that later on in my talk. It has to be acknowledged that this isn't straightforward, but systemic action research project that embraces complexity and celebrates the emergence and the changeable nature of research really shouldn't be straightforward, I suppose. It's supposed to be influenced by the reality of life and be contextually rooted and influenced by a number of changeable factors. So what I've got on the page here is just a very quick kind of look at some of our investigations that are on our Notion page. So we use Notion to help manage collaboration across the project. And then on the right-hand side is something that we drew up over a year ago now. So it's completely out of date, so I do apologize, but it's just a way of us thinking about how we're clustering and bringing our investigations together. But either way, I firmly believe that this multi-pronged approach, this multiple investigations, have been fundamental to our research into the concept of a united digital collection as a social machine. So this idea of a social machine has been present from the very beginning of the project. These post-it notes come from our opening conference in Bradford in February 2022. But I hope other people in the project would argue and agree that it's through our approach to multiplicity that we've been able to think through how an open and contributory national collection or united digital collection as a social machine might exist. I'll take a little detour here, and I won't dwell on this for too long, but we devoted some time to thinking in the project and learning more about the concept of social machines before we decided to adopt the metaphor or not. We focused on Chabot et al.'s work, which specified 10 principles of a social machine, and we tried to work through what they would mean in the context of a united digital collection. So some examples we worked through, very, very simple at the time, but just wanted to make sure it worked for us. A united digital collection as a social machine is made up of parts. So it connects heritage materials from different institutions and different communities. A united digital collection as a social machine is emergent. For us, it's not fixed, but rather it's generated by ongoing contributions. So we kind of did this exercise in a workshop, and a cross-project workshop in March last year. And since then, we agreed that we would be using this as a concept in our work. And there's more investigations now that directly investigate how the dynamics of a social machine feature in our work. I think my co-facilitator, Helen Graham, spoke about this at the TaNC conference at the British Museum in April last year, building on the work of Alex Butterworth in the project and his Congruence Engine manifesto that was published in our Science Museum Group Journal special issue towards the end of, what was it, in January 2023, I think. From the onset of the project, it's been pretty clear that Congruence Engine is not something that we're looking to build, but that we are the researchers on the project, the partners on the project, the people involved. We are the Congruence Engine. Therefore, our practical focus in Congruence Engine has been to materialize and test the idea of what a contributory UK digital collection might look like, enabling a range of historical researchers, whether paid or researching in their spare time, to access tools and techniques, develop their skills that would allow them to pursue their interests. So as a project, as we rehearse the process of developing a united digital collection within this kind of emergent structure of a social machine, we are refining what a united digital collection is and might become. Fundamental to this has been enabling researchers and partners to chart their own routes, developing investigations that combine historical questions with targeted experimental use of tools and techniques, paying attention to the contextual and material realities of the different constituents of people and institutions. Therefore, a core part of what our methodology enables is constant adjusting and reworking and tuning up of understanding the social machine. However, with an active real-life experimentation at the heart of action research, we knew that as researchers on the project, we are actively modeling the social machine ourselves, but we are only one part of the picture. We needed to experiment with a wider constituency of people who might contribute to a united digital collection. So in October last year, we made a decision to spend a final phase of the research working in Bradford, exploring what a local instance of a social machine might look like in practice. We've been working remotely and on the ground to help facilitate and bring together heritage data and people in different constellations. We're seeking to work with a range of different people to understand the social and technical requirements for a social machine to work. Now, this isn't up to date, just want to give that the proviso, but I wanted to share this screenshot of a Nodo visualization created by my colleague, Alex Fitzpatrick, showing the interconnections between the arts and heritage organisations and individuals in Bradford. And these are just the ones that we're aware of and in contact with. So you can see here there's clearly a complex, rich social network already at play there. In this work, we've needed to remain very aware that the role we're playing in Bradford. We are a well-funded national project attached to the Science Museum Group, as well as attached to local and distributed universities. Our presence and resource enables work to happen that may not happen naturally as part of a social machine in the wild. So part of our active observations and reflections that we've been doing in Bradford is to think about the power dynamics that we bring to collaborations, and for us to really consider whether we are participating in activity as a general actor within a pre-existing social machine, or whether we are acting as instigators of the social machine. So we've been referring to this as kind of wearing two hats, I suppose. With one hat, we're investigating what the minimal infrastructure of a united digital collection might be. We're holding, developing, and facilitating that work using observation as a key mode there. And with the other hat, we're running investigations that use the social machine, developing sets of connected Bradford data sets, and developing other Bradford-related prongs to our work, actively driving its generation. So it's quite often complicated to disentangle the two hats at times. We're about to run and participate in a series of events in Bradford, either deepening our understanding of the social elements of the technical work we've been doing, facilitating the use of some of the tools we've been working with in a Bradford context, or observing what is enabled through connecting different forms of data. And in doing this, we are definitely experimenting with both of our hats on. So I've referred to multiplicity quite a bit, but I also want to pay attention to these points of convergence and cohering that we've had to do in the project as well. So being geographically distributed, we are not able to meet up in person as much as we'd like. Many of us in the project find face-to-face conversations incredibly helpful in working through difficult and complex issues and topics. When we do meet in project-wide workshops, we use a variety of different facilitation methods as part of our action research approach. So as action research facilitators, Helen and myself have sought to organize events and workshops spaced throughout the project as acts of conversion, bringing the project together to make collective decisions or work through the implications of a range of possible ways forward. Now we're at the point where other people are also designing and arranging workshops around specific topics too. And facilitation of those workshops have become a core part of deepening and enriching our research. We've had at least 12 workshops of this ilk, sometimes on topics central to the project as a whole. For example, whether or not we're going to adopt the use of social machine, or whether or not we're going to spend the final phase of the project in Bradford. And then other workshops, as I've noted, have been focusing on specific topics. We've had ones on visualizing oral histories or generative AI and ethics. When I think through the role of facilitation in our cohering work, I particularly like this quote from Jenny McEwen, describing what she calls the different polarities and paradoxes in facilitation. So sometimes as facilitators, we need to follow a group's agenda, while at other times facilitators need to lead the group's agenda. Sometimes the facilitators need to question, inquire, consult, whilst other times they need to direct. Sometimes facilitators need to listen, other times they need to tell people what to do. Sometimes they need to nurture and support people in that group or community, other times they need to challenge. Sometimes facilitators provide structure and time boundaries, at other times they need to flex structure and time boundaries. So this is something that I've been trying to hold close to me as I try and facilitate action research in the moment in these workshops. In some cases, it has become clear the room is not ready to cohere just yet, and noticing and fighting my kind of internal urge to reach complete consensus has been central to how this project has been run. However, convergence and cohering have taken place in the project in different ways as well, not just through the workshops. But as we're moving towards the end of our core research phase of the project, I suppose, there's been an emerging sense that we need to cohere the multi-stranded approach that I've already kind of introduced, and begin finding meaningful ways to group the lots of research that's happening. I noted earlier that this began quite naturally, where the researchers on the project increasingly saw connections between their work. And sometimes that's been facilitated through the investigations meeting that the project set up, but other times it's happened outside those formal structures that we put in place. We began clustering the work towards the end of 2023, but more formally attempted to create this diagram as a 5-part structure in 2024, the early part of this year. So the diagram being shown here is not intended as a final version, so please don't think this is exactly what we're doing. As always with the action research, we are working to develop structures and processes that are useful at that point in time. It may not be useful past the summer, we don't know, but it was useful at the time. So cohering of investigations is pragmatic for us. It's helping us pinpoint and name the intervention the project has been making. So for example, taxonomies and ontology development, spatial Bradford and linkage of narrative materials all refer to different types and clusters of investigation that have been focusing on connecting collections. And then we have the social machine that runs through and beyond those groups of investigations, trying to illustrate that the social technical processes in those linking activities are all part of the social machine. And then around all of that, there's this broader consideration of ethical and responsible research practices, and that kind of hugs us all. And even since this diagram was completed in March, the connections between the ethical and responsible research and the social machine are being developed and changed. So again, it's a constantly moving game, isn't it? But creating space to follow lines of inquiry that emerge, holding the complexity of the project whilst weighing up the need to communicate clearly what is happening without flattening that complexity has been a constant negotiation for the project. And I think it's probably the same in many of the other TaNC projects. But what I really appreciate about the action research method is that it does not attempt to hide it. It's recognized as it is something to be really attentive to. So I'm aware this has been somewhat of a whistle-stop tour through the project and what has been enabled through the action research approach. But I just wanted to end with a few critical reflections, I suppose. Systemic action research, especially at this scale, is a journey. For all the benefits, there are challenges. By embracing emergence, you also create a certain level of uncertainty. By leaning into complexity, you also welcome an element of obscurity. It's quite hard to really communicate exactly what's happening at that time. By promoting multiplicity, you sometimes lose an aspect of depth. However, what we're trying to do in Congruence Engine is not look at one specific approach in depth. We've had this opportunity to immerse ourselves in a very quickly developing field of research and technological development and test out a vast number of different approaches to very fast-moving digital techniques. It's been brilliant to be able to be adaptive and change and respond to that. We're also not looking to find definitive answers and make definitive statements. So the flattening out of our complexity in order to make one or two well-knitted together claims isn't our core concern. We're interested in the contextual textures of our work, how one approach might work for the Science Museum Group, but not for Brad museums and galleries, and how another approach might seem doable for Bradford Local Studies Library, but it's not going to work for the volunteer-run Saltaire collection. Every methodology has its difficulties, and working within the spirit of action research can at times be quite unnerving. However, I always like to refer back to this quote when I'm feeling a bit on the back foot. So if you think you know what you are doing as an action researcher and that you have it comfortably in hand, then you're not doing it. You're not on a learning's edge. And that's it from me. So thank you, everyone. And I'm looking forward to a discussion later on.
Thank you, Arran. Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so we can see, I mean, it's quite self-explanatory, the benefits of action research in this kind of complexity of technologies and human working together, which links perfectly to Katrina's presentation from Unpath'd Waters, where they're within their context of a multi-partner research project. They're aiming to combine maritime heritage data and explore how can we ground ourselves in a values framework to lead more relevant and ethical research, ethically sound practices. So in the next presentation, as part of the Unpath'd Waters project, Katrina will be presenting a practical understanding on how a values framework could strengthen the ethical posture of this project of Unpath'd Waters, to reflect on the challenges and achievements of various approaches and data gathering methods over 2 years. Katrina Foxton teases out the lessons learned and offers areas for further development towards this venture. So to introduce Katrina Foxton, she's an engagement project officer at MOLA and a research associate at Unpath'd Waters project. On the Unpath'd Waters, she is delivering on the work package 5, which focuses on values, audience mapping, and evaluation. She gained her doctoral research. She gained her doctoral research from University of York, where she focused on tracking values within the practices of community groups and council practitioners. So, Katrina, thank you very much, and thank you, Unpath'd Waters, for sharing your time with us. So whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to Arran Rees. That was a really great talk, giving me lots to think about, taking lots of notes. So yes, I'm Dr. Katrina Foxton. I'm a community engagement officer delivering at commercial archaeology projects here at MOLA. But I also explore how research practices can be applied in commercial contexts. Alongside this work, I have been the values researcher for Unpath'd Waters project for 2 years. And I was brought onto the project by Dr. Sarah Perry, whose extensive research and position for community engagement is very well known. And she is the lead for the Unpath'd Audience and Evaluation Work Package, otherwise known as Work Package 5. So together we've been exploring what it means to bake values into a hefty cross-partner research project for the purpose of upholding an ethical framework that guides all project outputs and our behaviours, particularly when collaborating with each other and our audiences. So today I'll firstly be explaining how we created our values framework, then reflecting on the findings of this experimental work, and finally giving some recommendations going forward. So for those who may not know, here's a quick background to the project. In simple terms, Unpath'd Waters seeks to connect audiences with currently disparate maritime heritage data. So more than just the shipwrecks, we're talking archives, shipping logs, environmental studies, captain diaries, citizen science captured archaeological recordings from the foreshore from all across the UK. We have 13 PIs, COIs, 5 collaborators, 8 partners from a range of museums, universities, heritage organisations, consultants, and that results in about 65 plus individuals working on 8 separate work packages within specific deliverables for this 3-year AHRC funded project within TaNC. And that's not including those who we've collaborated with as audience and co-designers in research workshops and events. This could easily push the number up to 100. I'm not trying to compete with Arran here, but just to point out that we've got quite a large crew, and this does have a bearing on the impact of the values framework. So with regards to the premise of Unpath'd values, you can consult a blog post that will be shared in the chat, hopefully to everyone. And basically this details the methodology a bit more, because we've got quite a lot to cover in 20 minutes. Essentially, Work Package 5 was tasked with creating a list of internalised values within Unpath'd Waters, and this was born of a collaborative discussion with the Unpath'd Work Package leads, and then we worked with the wider consortium to create specific measures by which we could all live by our values. And thereafter, we developed a value framework so we could source supporting data in various forms, methodologically. And as you can see in the blog, we drew our methodology from a philosophy from value-led design and the work of ethnographer Kate Shilton. So here's how we sort of went about creating the values framework. Firstly, in March 2022, Sarah and I led a collaborative workshop with the work package leads to create 6 values. This was a very iterative process with 5 steps to it. And I remember that the final step was a big flurry of people co-editing a page, a list rather. And there was all sorts of language in it. At one point we had 9 values and that went down to 6. I'll just read the resulting values out loud in terms of the main terms. So we have the equitable value, the connecting with people on their own terms, empowering through collaboration, reliable and sustainable, constructive and adventurous. I'll be honest, there were values that I disliked and I had some favorites too, but that wasn't the point. We've made these together and they were devised by Unpath'd. Subsequently, our 6 values required measures, and after consulting with the wider consortium, we had enough feedback to create 14 measures, which then required different methodologies and an understanding of the positive indicators. Apologies in advance for the next slide, which visually isn't very appealing, but that's kind of the point here. So quite soon after establishing the value measures, we realized that the resulting workload was quite high. 14 measures times 8 work packages, that's 84 potential actions or data gathering exercises. And we were getting feedback from our work package leads that people were feeling a little at sea when considering how they could contribute to the values framework and concerned about their own capacity to do so. We quickly became, we being work package guys, seen as not only the value advocates, but the experts and regulators, and sought for advice. And it was interesting, but not necessarily what we were expecting or prepared for. And as the value framework itself grew as an iterative project, it became impossible for us to support each work package in their value contributions. So we took a step back to see if we could be more strategic about which work packages were well placed to lead, partially contribute to, or not at all, towards each value measure. I threw this table together after consulting with a project manager and the Work Package 6 project director, and the resulting heat map, as we called it, helped, but it was unsettling in another way. This was project management territory with all its wonderful colour schemes, and I think it was also a bit of a culture shock. Nonetheless, with that noted, in preparation for the next phase of the project, Sarah and I worked on the values framework to not only consider who was contributing to the data to support values, but how. So what you see here is a very simplified version of the framework in methodological terms, covering different data gathering techniques, which were mainly qualitative, but they include generating survey questions for audience evaluation, project reflection, co-design methodologies, and also technical reports. Sorry, I had a bit of a split there on the slides. So these were the main methodologies that were carried out in 2023. There are heaps to learn about each of these methodologies and how we can utilize them for further value frameworks. I won't be able to go into too much detail today, but I will feed some of the considerations into my recommendations at the end. One of the key challenges here was not being able to support work with all the work packages equally. Having equal spread was nigh on impossible, although actually using the monthly management reports as data really did help in that respect and get an insight into what each of the work packages was doing and how they were doing it. We did have some really interesting, rich data from the co-design workshops with Work Package 4, led by Stuart Jeffrey at the Glasgow School of Art. And some of the reflections from these actually then helped us with the design of the co-design, which I think it sort of draws in parallel to the overall premise of the Congruence Engine. So there was a bit of action research with regards to the co-design work there. So after all that massive of data gathering to see if we were living by our values, as part of our remit, we were required to do an audit of the data, and this involved some coding work. I drew from Kate Shilton's work on value levers to develop a very simple coding matrix. I'm really interested in how values sort of develop and flow and flux and change from one sort of kind of stage to another. And so I basically took an approach as whether a value was being targeted at. So for instance, somebody in a meeting saying, we should do XYZ thing in XYZ way, or if a challenge was arising that was being blocked, or evidence of that value actually being achieved, for example, a co-design participant stating that they felt catered for in a workshop, which helped towards value connecting with people on their own terms, for instance. So this lovely table again. What are the results of doing the coding and the interpretation of the qualitative data? Before I go into this, I want to highlight that as a researcher and someone who supports co-design work, even in my commercial work, I feel strongly that whilst values frameworks should guide and strengthen heritage outputs, to go to the extreme risks the creation of top-down bureaucracy and tick box tendencies. And I'm using RuPaul to kind of interrupt that. I felt conscious that this could be seen as value policing, but I do hope that there are ways to mitigate against this risk and for value frameworks to be more fluid and alive. So this is what I suggest we don't do. It's a results table for the achievement of values across all work packages and also the co-designers and the feedback from work package 3.1. So this table does not reflect the results from targeting and challenges of the values, and it does not represent the full picture. I don't think anyone wants to work in a context where if they don't score highly on a certain value, they get scrutinized. And I don't think comparing helps at all, with the aim to live by philosophical concepts and morals. This is a far cry from what we think we should be doing and happening with ethically driven value frameworks. I think a more meaningful way to approach this came from the audit I carried out for each value measure, which demonstrated all of the relevant data, both qualitative and quantitative, and the associated coded quotes. Of note is the little grey box on the left, where I actually reviewed the suitability of the measure and put forward recommendations for the future. This was a useful exercise. It will help with report writing, and it could, if acted upon more quickly, be a useful tool for learning whether a measure was useful for the project or relevant, so that changes could be made more quickly. And getting up close to the data meant that I noticed things about it. I've been really intrigued by how the values are woven into conversations and occasionally noted that they morphed into each other. So we get a sense of values dovetailing one another. And there were moments within conversations, usually sparked off by one person saying something negative or raising a challenge, that became really value rich or value hotspots. And I think this could be a really fruitful line of research. Perhaps there are ways to learn to facilitate value-rich conversations, and maybe I should be speaking to Arran more about that, by embracing the challenges which lead to relevant and practical ideas of how design outputs can be created in line with values. And this is some excerpts from a co-design session. We have one participant explaining that he doesn't really know what to say, fell out of his depth, but it's great. And that ends with some other participant adding on that I was particularly valued the input from people whose experience is significantly different to myself. And you can see that I've basically coded each of those parts of the conversation to different values, so showing how that they kind of flow together. So, are we living by our values, or rather more practically, does this value framework work? The data suggests partially yes and no, sort of. But the biggest gain is learning about which practices and contexts might best support value frameworks and ethics in large multi-partner projects. So at this point, here are the main reflections. On the downside, we reflected there are too many values and measures. Some overlap with each other unhelpfully. So the constructivism value could be incorporated in connectivity value, as this is essentially the end goal. And equity, sometimes interestingly duplicated with adventure. The language was bureaucratic and overcomplicated, and this we were pulled up on by our co-designers, particularly from the visually impaired, who are a key audience. There's not an equal spread of data across the work packages, so that's something I've mentioned a few times because we didn't have the capacity to spread ourselves out. With regards to the technical reports, I didn't actually have the expertise to decipher some of these, so more people with different viewpoints would be really helpful in sort of pulling apart some of the FAIR audit that was done by ADS to see how our data was conforming to reliability measures. I think this is a big one, not speedy enough. The value framework was not speedy enough to have findings to be integrated into real-time practice or feed into new values. And I think there are ways to do this, and this was discovered within the work package for co-design workshops. We haven't worked out how to abide by our own values in exposure to our collaborators' values. And this includes organizations who come with their own values or people's individual values. And that's something that came up in January at the cross-project ethics workshop that we ran as part of TaNC. So that's something that we know that other projects in TaNC are coming up against. And sometimes professional organizational values might sit in tension with the personal project values. I should have added here that actually some of our data, being maritime heritage data, there are certain parts of the information within that are also in tension with some of our values. Some of the values measures, sustainability, for instance, are very difficult and nigh impossible to achieve, and these offer critical tensions into major initiatives and the context in which we're trying to achieve our aims. So we've got dichotomies between rural and urban, local and national, new builds and reuse in terms of like how can we achieve bringing together rural and urban if we're trying to keep our carbon footprint down and not being able to travel as much. However, on the plus side, we have got better understanding of how to practically gain the data. There are ways to visualize this data, although right for improvement, better understanding of what relevant measures might look like, better understanding about how to support values advocacy. I think challenge inventories might be a useful tool if we can capture challenges and then see them in real time. They could be useful, bring useful perspectives to the barriers to development. Emerging codes which support existing values are there, and I have ideas of how to bake those in. So essentially, living values should be called instead living values framework, with emphasis on the framework being living. Value-rich conversations and their relationship to challenges is a very compelling line for further research, as is the role of leadership, but more research is required again there. So just to sort of go to the last few slides here, I'll quickly go through the recommendations. Essentially, we're looking towards the importance of cultivating and persisting with difficult, values-rich conversations. We would like to advocate for more leaner, responsive frameworks and methodologies for advocacy work, evaluation techniques, data analysis, and feeding back into practice. On the point of evaluation techniques, I just want to give you an example of responsive evaluation technique that Sarah and I have recently developed off the back of this research. It's basically rethinking about evaluation entirely because of the work that we've done closely with the visually impaired key audiences and the work that we did with Stuart Jeffrey on the co-design workshops. And we thought about how evaluation often tends to favour a small number of methods, and they tend to be conceptually focused on enjoyment and education. It also privileges the visual and verbal, and does set a dualist perspective, separating the mind, the body, and conscious and unconscious mind and material body from the external world. So, and very few studies even bother to evaluate with the visually impaired. And this is work that was identified by Sarah and John Comby from the National Maritime Museum. And there's nothing really to help with innovating evaluation to cater to their lived experiences. So what would it look like to orientate our approach to evaluation towards a holistic view of a bodily experience? And we've recently experimented with some ideas drawn from summer aesthetic approaches, which summer aesthetic means of the body, and aesthetic obviously means visual. Now these do naturally suit people who are sighted and people with high degrees of literacy, people with sufficient oral skills and the confidence to vocalize their experiences. However, in challenging the spirit of connecting with people on their own terms and collaboration, we have since had some really interesting ideas with the VIP community that will be baked into, we hope, the evaluation of the Unpath'd travelling exhibition. So this is really promising. So that's the example. The final recommendations, yes, this is an obvious one. We would like to fence time, money, and expertise to create discrete sub-work packages specific to values and projects. And this is because value advocates are crucial to championing values throughout our work. Should these be pre-assigned or emerge organically, as was discussed at the cross-project ethics workshop in January, and we recommend a combination of both. We talked about when to define values as early as possible, as some of our partners needed to have that support sooner, and to build in robust means to truly let them live and introduce other values into the mix. Understanding your professional partners' values before you begin and how they hold themselves accountable to those values, and stay attentive to your indicators of success around values. How do they reflect the values of collaborators and community audiences? One final point. So I was asked in February the so what question. So what if we live by our values? What does it actually mean? And this is what I have to say to that. If we live by our values flexibly and reflectively, we can deepen the relevancy of our work. By relevancy, I mean that we create working relationships with partners and audiences based on trust and with expectations managed. This increases likelihood of legacy for projects. We can also build resilience against challenges and create innovative solutions as a result. And we gain a deepened appreciation of our project aims and the practical means to achieve them. And I think that would feel very satisfying, and I think it would be a sign of ethical health in a project. So more of this to come in my final project report. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Awesome. Let me just remove the spotlight. All right. Thank you both, Arran and Katrina. Yeah, so you can actually see how both spaces overlap with each other. I was going to ask eventually how, Arran, how do you think the action research links back to the values and vice versa? But before I jumped into that, I think it's important how you both embrace that not everything will be successful and you turn it to a positive. So this idea of this kind of post-mortem approach into that things can break and things will break, especially with technology and disruptive technologies, is very almost impossible to know how disruptive technologies will affect society, especially in social machines. So I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more on how do we or how heritage organizations, especially people working with technology and this type of new innovations, how do we deal with things breaking? How do we plan for that, both from human and technology perspective? So anyone who will be happy to take it.
I'm happy to give you a break and start if you want, Katrina.
Yeah, go for it, Arran.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Javier. Just a nice, easy one to settle us into to the discussion. No, I think it's a really good point. I think we have tried to be very open with the fact that what we're doing is iterative, and action research with these cycles. The whole point of them is you do a cycle, and if your findings at the end of that first cycle, and I say cycles is really roughly defined because they don't work in that perfectly cyclical way. They're all over the place. But I mean, if you do a piece of work and you come to the end of it and you think, well, that hasn't worked as I planned, then you've learned something from that. So then your next cycle of action research takes into account that that's not going to work. And we've learned things in terms of that, what doesn't work technically, what doesn't work socially, were there conflicts, were there tensions that you could notice? How do we dissipate these? And they become your active research questions in your next cycle. So we've really kind of embraced that in the project, that when something doesn't work, we are not afraid to say, we're parking that, we're writing it up, we're reflecting what we've learned from it. And there's 40 other investigations that we can go and kind of run and have a look into. So I think we've really been trying to communicate that, and I think it's been lived in the project. And I'm sure I'll hear from my colleagues later on whether or not I've accurately reflected how that feels in the project. But I think that's what we've tried to enable.
Katrina, would you like? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take it up. I mean, so how do we reflect? Yeah, I think one of the main challenges that, you know, that everyone sort of will complain about is, oh, we should have had more time, more money, and so on and so forth. And maybe that's boring, but I think what we've tried to do with this is we've always seen it as an adventure, and one of the value measures was actually that we will be embracing success and the failure as well. So that was baked in from the beginning. I remember with the initial collaborative conversation with the work package leads, there was a lot of talk around that, and there was a lot of intrigue around the notion of failure and failing and how to embrace it. So that was worked in as a value that we could all embrace. And then of course the privilege of then tracking failure within the project, and this was enabled through you know, multiple avenues of, you know, looking at the management reports, looking at the data within the VIPs, and let me tell you, the visually impaired community do not hold back when we failed. So, and I think it was just, yeah, approaching failure as a professional and as a human, in both wearing two hats, because it's tough, but it's worth it.
I think there's something about failure as well, and not always thinking of there's something that needs to be done to disassociating failure with negativity.
Yeah.
And I really liked your notion of adventure. I thought it was really nice. And I think it kind of aligns with the kind of uncertainty that comes from action research as well, that it can be really energizing and it can be terrifying as well. And so can adventure. Some people are adventurous, some people aren't. And there's no kind of negative connotation on being adventurous or not as well.
But that's where the value-rich conversations started like appearing in the data. We had, oh God, some really awkward moments in some of the workshops where it felt as though people were really not wanting to engage with us on certain questions and really struggling to find the relevancy. And then it would just, the awkward pause would last a little longer, and then something would happen, and that would open something up, and a corner would be, you know, taken, and then we're on our way. And that happened a number of times to sort of jump out. So it's always, I thought one of the things that you said about consensus was really interesting. And I put down a note saying that it's a fallacy because it's always temporal and always contextualized.
100%.
Exactly. I think so. This is why I think these two presentations are key. These are not just management or methodologies for research. They're actually strategies to integrate different worldviews and ways of understanding. And so for culture heritage, that's essential to bring these different worldviews, which leads to my next question. So this idea of what you mentioned, Arran, about the complexity of worldviews and then linking that to the values. And of course, I'm not expecting an answer. I'm sorry for putting you in a weird position, but how do you deal when you have contradictory worldviews? So for example, now with these approaches towards decolonization, we have these new ways of cosmovisions of worldviews that do not exist in other parts of the world, or that perhaps a collection does not really represent that particular worldview or the research approach. So how do you deal, or what is the benefit of embracing these type of approaches to enable that kind of integration of that complexity of worldview, as you mentioned it, or different cosmovisions? Anyone?
I'll have a crack.
Okay.
I thought when Arran was talking about taking multiple worldviews, really interesting, because what the values exercise kind of was attempting to do was to build consensus, and to kind of like take a snapshot what everybody was thinking about at that time, coming from their different backgrounds and professional expertise and the different human experiences. So I thought that was really interesting. And of course, so the values kind of work as like a what's that phrase when you're talking about lightning? It's like a when the lightning strikes and it shows everything up, it's like a, someone's going to say it, it's a phrase that you say, basically illuminates a moment in time where it's things are set in stark contrast to each other. But I can't drill down to like problems with regards to the data, for instance, as highlighting some of the tensions. You would have to speak to my colleagues, for instance, at Work Package 2, Fraser Sturt, about some of the practicalities that they've been facing with regards to actually trying to pull those two things together. I can certainly speak about it from the visually impaired point of view, where you know, completely different lived experience, and finding that actually, even though we knew what we had to do was to connect with them on their own terms, Freudian slip there, we kept connecting with them on our own terms, and it was really hard to practice, to change our practices to, you know, because we were, for instance, we were initially thinking about brainstorming or mind mapping and using post-it notes. But of course, that we couldn't use that as a facilitative exercise, one that I love, because they wouldn't have been able to see how we arrange post-its on a board. And that's why we then opted to try and do this summer aesthetic technique slightly twisted so that it can bring to the fore the more visual and the haptic and the sensory aspect. We even brought in like poppers and things like that. So we are continuing to learn, and I think those tensions are just about learning through and pushing through, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really like that. Definitely. I think that one of the ways that it's worked for us, perhaps hasn't worked in every situation, but is the combination of different of the different kind of values we've taken from action research. So by bringing in multiple worldviews, but also saying that consensus isn't always important, that you can have different views, and by also the way that we've tried to enable quite open borders between our investigations. So when there are situations where maybe you don't fully agree with the way an investigation is being conceived of or being run, then you don't have to get involved in it. I think there's a case of that we're not holding all the researchers captive on the project and all the participants, and we wanted to try and create a kind of environment, I suppose, with the traditional work packages idea, we started off with them, and some people still kind of identify with their natural home work package, but we don't talk in the terms of work packages at all anymore, really, and people move across the project in different ways. So I think that has that kind of ability to switch a little bit has helped. And I'm not saying that we're open to all worldviews, but again, I'm not saying that we're a wildly diverse project, but when we talk about different worldviews, that's individuals. We're all unique individuals. We all have a very different worldview from each other. So maybe if we had vastly diverging worldviews in our project that was central, it may not have worked as tensionless as it has. But I can only speak to what we've experienced. And I think that there are obviously points of tension at different points and different ways people want to approach things, but by not trying to force people to do things or be stuck in their work packages that they are working on with someone who they don't really agree with, I think that's helped alleviate some of that, I suppose.
Yeah, and another question from me. So again, audience, feel free to post any questions on the Q&A. So one of the challenges, I think, once we flip the conversation, I mean, the cultural heritage sector, the cultural sector is very task demanding, so they're overwhelmed with a lot of the work they have to do. So how can we take these approaches for them? So first of all, why should they embrace this type of approaches? How do we take them? I mean, Katrina, you already mentioned that sometimes they could be very task demanding, but you had already this post analysis. So why should they take them? How can they take them? And so yeah, kind of a recommendations of why and how can these smaller organizations, community cultural heritage organizations, community groups, why should they take it? And from your own personal perspective, of course. Again, for both.
Why should they take?
Yeah. So, for example, in your case,
or United.
No, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Let me rephrase my question. So for example, there's a lot of benefits that you have showcased about using action research, but it could be seen as a very tasking process, especially, for example, the presentation from Katrina. There's a lot of evaluation. There's a lot of activity that needs to take place. So is this, where's the benefit of first of all, what is the benefit of taking this type of approaches into smaller organizations? Or is this not really accessible for smaller organizations? And if so, how do we take it to them? And what is the benefit of them? So it's kind of a very theoretical and open question, and perhaps with no answer.
I can have a go, but if you want to go, Katrina, you can go first.
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think I'm going to think it whilst I'm talking it through, which is dangerous. I am wondering immediately about people that I've worked with within the past, you know, volunteer groups, friends of groups, and obviously, yeah, it's a really difficult one to say because volunteer groups specifically, to put the onus on them to try and lead them to, and I guess that's what it is, isn't it? It's leadership, but also leadership to be open and take on worldviews, which is more than just leadership. It's about embracing many other things, which, yeah, I think it would, and this is the thing that I think often gets forgotten, or it's the unsaid thing, is that working relationships and working with people in a human-centric way is what makes these things happen, right? And we know it because we do it, and we put our, you know, more than just professional hats on to get these things through the door. And I guess that's the only, other than, you know, other than all of the tools and theory that I have, it's actually working with people on in an authentic, sincere way. And I think that's working in some ways, and unfortunately doesn't work in others. But I sort of sometimes see a chink and go for it. You know what I mean? It's, yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling. Over to you, Arran.
Oh, not at all. I think it's a complex thing to work through, isn't it? And to almost articulate. It aligns with this kind of expanded epistemology of action research. It's a way of being that is sometimes really hard to articulate, and it requires a lot of social energy, as you said, wearing more than just your professional hat at times. And I think there's a lot of energy that goes into this type of work. With action research specifically, I would say that action research as a method is a method to enact change. So I don't think that it's an operating method for cultural heritage organizations as such. But if they identify issues or they are self-aware of some issues that they've got, then action research is definitely a method that can be employed to help get to the root of those issues, understand what for them will work specifically to address those issues. The whole point of action research is not to say, well, we know this is an issue, and we'll apply how this issue was fixed in this context and try and apply it to that context, and then we're done. Because it kind of rejects that. You have to work through it yourself and understand that individual contexts are exactly that things work differently. But I think some of the values of action research, so talking about the multi-perspectival kind of views and the openness for people to operate where they best feel they're able to operate. It's difficult when you've got a predefined job description, and we've got inherent kind of hierarchies in these institutions. That it's difficult to move in those ways, but there's definitely kind of ways we can, or things we can be inspired by in how we take a human-centered approach, as Katrina said.
Am I allowed to add a little bit more?
Yeah, of course, of course. This is your webinar.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, as you say, Arran, action research is one tool methodology, and value frameworks is another that is rolled out, you know, commercially, charitably, is everywhere, and that's why it's so easy to, like, you know, to go down the project management route. It's and so for, you know, a small startup heritage organization, I'm thinking of one I'm trying to start now. I think one of the ways that we're trying to attend to the values, or what the principles of the thing is just having the conversations at the very beginning and to keep track of them. So to answer your question, Javier, there are practical ways. It's whether we can make sure that they don't become too static, and that's where, you know, that's where we'd ideally like to mess things up a bit.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And I wanted to raise this question because both of your projects, the Congruence Engine and Unpath'd Waters, have a very deep engagement with independent research organizations, with communities, and they have been part of the research. So and I think sometimes it's difficult for researchers, organizations, or even groups to figure out how do we become part fully of that larger ecosystem, of that larger organization. I think both of your presentations really encompass a way of how we can bring this on, and so beyond the analytics, but they kind of provide the pathway for other people to take part. So, for example, probably you can read already an observation on the Q&A. So it's not a question, but an observation. So the importance of having values-led approach relates to the way the future development of a truly, UK digital collection is envisaged. The swarms of organizations of all kinds and scales working towards common goals will need roadmaps and aids to help them coexist and collaborate for the duration of the relationships. Values frameworks are, in a way, a rich way of organizational culture, cultural diversity, and potential tensions can be accommodated and negotiated so that the outcomes meet the ambitions of this extraordinary vision. So yeah, so in a way, I think that probably said it better than what I was trying to say. So your approaches, your methodologies are.
B1 Sloan.
I'm gonna say.
Why doesn't B1 Sloan in?
Yeah, so we can send you a packet of chocolates or something.
Yeah.
But I think that's the idea of it is tasking. So what are the well, I think that, and I will close that. It sounds negative. But what are the downfalls? So you mentioned, Katrina, that it's very task demanding. So when you facilitate this type of approaches, what are the challenges when you bring them into let's say, a small organization?
I think one of the key challenges is with everything that was said in the Q&A comment just there in mind, it is about ultimately trying to the challenge is trying to show that you are aligning to it, and that involves evaluation. And evaluation is one sort of moment in time when you're doing a workshop, or if you're doing a survey where something changes in the dynamic and the relationship that you're having with those people. That means that it's suddenly it's like you've been having a chat with someone and suddenly you take a magnifying glass. That's what it feels like sometimes. But I think that one of the things that Sarah and I are exploring now, having done this research, and I think that's been one of the greatest gains from doing this research, although it is task heavy and time consuming, is trying to develop ways to evaluate that are actually also valuable, follow the values, and encompass the embody, because there's no point in having a workshop that's wonderful and brilliant and making everyone feel comfortable and connecting people on their own terms, and then doing an evaluation at the end, which is just a survey, because that kind of undoes all of the good work you just did. And there are actually some really exciting, innovative ways to do evaluation that can help, that can be aligned with your values framework, and enable some really interesting results. And so we're really keen to see how we can particularly work with the visually impaired to consider how they would like to voice their feedback. And I'm sure there are other examples I'm not thinking of right now, but over to you, Arran.
No, I think you're totally right. And I think that there are things that we would like to do to almost test this, test our idea of a United Digital Collection as a social machine further, and test out our ideas of non-conflict, or well, acknowledging that conflict will arise in this kind of space, this open contributory national collection or UK digital collection. What B1 Sloan, Barney, said, and what you said, Katrina, as well. I just think that it'd be really useful to kind of think more about evaluation methods for that in our work as well. I mean, we have applied values to the open contributory social machine. We wanted to be anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and all these things that inherently come with cultural heritage institutions. And how do we create those spaces, and what kind of frameworks, what values frameworks, and what then negotiation spaces and processes are in place to kind of alleviate where tensions arise where one person's values and contribution to a national collection contravenes with someone else's values and contribution to a national collection, or sorry, I keep on using national collection, United Digital Collection. Yeah, I don't think that we're in the project going to get to the point where we've really pinpointed that and really worked through what those processes mean and how you can evaluate those. And so yeah, it'd be lovely to maybe talk about that at some point.
Yeah, sorry, I'm doing another spin back after that. I think one of the really interesting things, and I know I keep referring to this cross-project ethics workshop that we held in January, which basically was multiple members of different TaNC projects coming together to talk about ethics and ethics frameworks that they try to create. And one of the key points that came from that workshop, which I thought was really interesting with regards to sort of TaNC-wide policy, was this idea of potentially tracking sort of interpretations of data. It's kind of a way of doing metadata essentially, but I think that's a really interesting approach to what sort of your particular problem, Arran, because it's like, Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB's approach to buildings conservation is, make it reversible, make it so that it's not set in time. And maybe we could take that approach to data as well, so that anyone can come along and essentially have add their viewpoint onto an interpretation. I think that could be quite valuable for some of the a valuable legacy for TaNC.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, embracing this approach of data. I mean, not only software as a service, but now data as a service. So the metadata also need to be contextualized. But yeah, I completely agree. There's a beautiful question on the Q&A. So if any of you would like to share a memorable learning moment for you working with this approach, I think that's a beautiful way of closing the webinar. That's a beautiful question. Thank you, both of you. Yeah.
So many.
You only get one.
Oh, I'm going to mute myself first. I need to think.
Right, I'll ramble for a second and give us both some thinking time. I mean, yeah, there's been lots. I suppose there's valuable learning moments for the project, and there's valuable learning moments for myself as an action research facilitator. And I think, it says personal memorable, so I'll go for that one. I suppose I had a conversation with a colleague recently who it's really useful to have kind of action research chats every now and again, just to be like, how am I presenting myself as a facilitator in here, being self-aware of yourself in those environments. And one of the things that I really had to learn, and I kind of refer to it in my presentation a little bit as well, is my urge to fix. I have this kind of inherent urge to fix issues, which is at conflict with our approach to divergence. So there's been a really kind of strong learning moment for me. And I can't pinpoint exactly where it is, but it came up in a conversation with a colleague through these kind of action research conversations you have sometimes, these reflective moments where I was like, yeah, that's been a major learning curve for me, is that I am not naturally built to sit with silence and conflict, but or not conflict, it never quite gets to conflict, but divergence, and forcing myself to and learning to be in that moment has been a beautiful thing for me, I'd say.
Thank you.
Also guilty of trying to fix things. The awkward pauses I can manage now. I mean, yeah, I've had some really memorable moments. I think one that's coming to mind is actually the digital analog connector event that we did for Unpath'd Waters. and I was helping support that project, but I was taking notes from people in a room, and one person who I'd previously not been able to connect with, which again, that's an emotional challenge for professional community engagement person, not being able to connect with someone, and they normally put the barriers down, but completely opened up in this particular context. I wasn't sort of the main sort of person that they were talking to, but in the context of talking to other people and me taking notes, that was so. Yeah, I was really grateful for that, and also just the whole event, because it was a really wonderful, inspirational moment to see all of these different partners coming into this event together and laughing and about archival excerpts out from ship's books, and yeah, that was a really memorable moment.
Perfect. I think this is a beautiful way of ending the webinar. Thank you both of you for opening up this way, for sharing your experiences. So yeah, thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Arran. Thank you to Congruence Engine for Arran, and thank you to Unpath'd Waters for Katrina. Thank you also to Sarah Perry for contributing to that work package.